The warm gold light of Delmonico's private dining room usually created an atmosphere of celebration, but tonight, it only served to highlight the chilling tension that had settled around our table. I sat at the head, surrounded by my mentors, my manager, and the classmates who had become my chosen family, people who genuinely saw the work I did. But the air was thickest between me and the two people who should have been the proudest, my mother and father. My manager, Michael, was on his feet, holding his champagne glass high, his expression earnest and kind. He was praising my dedication, the all-nighters, the sheer grit it took to graduate top of my class with a Stanford MBA and an immediate consulting offer. I felt a small, unfamiliar flutter in my chest, a fragile thing called hope. I turned toward my parents, expecting, demanding, just one shared glance, one soft flicker of pride. Instead, my father leaned back in his leather chair, the picture of calculated disinterest, and murmured a comparison loud enough for the table to absorb. Compared to a doctor, it simply doesn't measure up. The applause for Michael's toast faded into a stunned silence. I felt my cheeks flush crimson, but years of swallowing disappointment had taught me to smile through the pain. I wanted to scream that I had paid for this dinner, that the education they dismissed had been funded by years of my own labor, not theirs, but I simply nodded, a forced, tight movement. Then, my mother, in her infinite capacity to elevate one daughter by crushing the other, delivered the blow. She spoke softly, casually, as if remarking on the dryness of the wine. You know, sometimes I wonder why Claire takes things so seriously. Ashley never causes this kind of drama. The room seemed to tilt. My chest tightened, and the air felt heavy, suffocating. I knew something horrible was coming, that the conversation was spiraling into the familiar territory of my worthlessness. But the words that followed were worse than anything I could have rehearsed in my worst nightmares. They didn't come as a shout, or even an angry confrontation. They came with the same ease and indifference someone uses to comment on the weather. We wish you were never born. My blood ran cold, freezing every impulse, every thought. For a long, unbearable heartbeat, I just sat there, registering the absolute, brutal finality of her statement. The silence in the room was deafening, a vacuum where conversation and celebration had been moments before. I saw my manager half rise from his seat, ready to interject, but I didn't wait. I felt every pair of eyes fixed on me, waiting for me to crumble, to cry, to finally confirm the drama they believed I always sought. But instead of tears, a cold, hard resolve took root, a force I didn't know I possessed. I pushed my chair back. The sound of the scraping would cutting through the silence, like a sharp, clean blade. I managed 2 words, my voice hollow and foreign. Excuse me. I didn't look at either of them. I didn't look back at the people who were kind enough to feel embarrassment on my behalf. I simply turned and walked away, my heels hitting the hardwood floor in sharp, uneven beats, a cadence of final departure. I was leaving the dinner, yes, but I was also leaving a life. The world was split open, and I was walking through the fracture, a moment that felt both terrifying and liberating, knowing that nothing, absolutely nothing, would ever be the same again after those 7 horrifying words. That moment, those words, would be the catalyst for the greatest decision of my life. I grew up in a place that looked like a postcard of stability, a 2-story colonial on a quiet, predictable street in suburban Rochester. The house was solid, the lawn was always meticulously kept, and the scent of freshly cut grass and my mother's baking created an illusion of perfect domestic tranquility. Yet inside those 4 walls there was a constant, almost invisible energy that determined who mattered and who didn't. This energy, this gravitational pull, was entirely centered on my younger sister, Ashley. She was the star, the sun, the girl whose name was synonymous with warmth, love, and unquestioned success. From the time we were toddlers, she possessed an innate, bright charm that effortlessly captivated our parents. If Ashley fell and scraped her knee, my mother reacted as if a national tragedy had occurred, fetching first aid supplies and offering endless, soothing comfort. If Ashley drew a crayon stick figure, it was framed and hung in the most prominent spot in the living room, a testament to her inherent talent. I quickly understood the unspoken order of the universe in our home. Ashley was to be celebrated, and I was merely to exist, a quiet, functional background character. I remember distinctly the day I won the regional math competition when I was 14. It wasn't a minor award. It was a certificate recognizing my dedication and aptitude for a difficult subject. I carried that piece of paper home from the ceremony like it was spun glass, terrified I'd crease the corners. I found my mother folding laundry in the basement, her attention entirely focused on smoothing out a stack of my father's shirts. I laid the certificate carefully on the perfectly organized basket of clothes. She didn't even look up. Her response was a distracted hum, a simple, non-committal, "That's nice." The conversation, which I had hoped would be a turning point, ended right there. She then immediately pivoted to what she considered important, adding, with a genuine, beaming smile in her voice, "Ashley's volunteering at the hospital today. Isn't that wonderful? She's making real impact." The contrast was stark, brutal, and defining. My academic excellence, something concrete and earned through discipline, was dismissed as a triviality, while my sister's choice of extracurricular activity was elevated to heroic status. This pattern was relentless, a quiet erosion of my self-worth over 2 decades. It was the constant, silent comparison that did the most damage, the polite indifference that suggested my achievements were fundamentally flawed because they weren't her achievements. I learned to keep my successes quiet, to minimize my presence, because every time I tried to shine, the spotlight was not just taken away, but aggressively swung back to where my parents believed it rightfully belonged. This early conditioning taught me a harsh lesson. In my family, my value is zero unless it served to highlight Ashley's glow. The phrase real impact became the cruelest, most consistent measuring stick in our household, a boundary fence my mother used to define the vast distance between my sister's life and mine. According to her, real impact was the kind of work that involved saving lives, caring for the sick, or having a purpose that was easily digestible and morally superior. Ashley's decision to pursue medicine, even as an intern, gave my mother the rhetorical ammunition she needed to dismiss every single thing I ever did. The message was clear. My work, my efforts, my entire being lacked meaning because it wasn't a selfless, life-saving endeavor. Even my acceptance into a top-tier MBA program at Stanford was treated with this same condescending filter. When I shared the news, trembling with a mix of excitement and terror, my mother merely nodded, her eyes already glazing over, and launched into a detailed description of Ashley's recent rotation in the emergency room. My own monumental success, a lifelong dream realized through unimaginable hard work, was instantly relegated to a minor footnote in Ashley's ongoing saga of excellence. This constant, debilitating comparison forced me to work even harder, not to earn their love, which I realized was impossible, but simply to keep our family afloat, a burden they never acknowledged. Through high school, I clocked countless hours at a local coffee shop, rushing from class to my shift, where I'd wipe down sticky tables and study until my eyes burned. The money I earned wasn't for luxuries or savings. It went straight into the household bills. This continued through college, where I held 3 different jobs simultaneously, tutoring late nights, cleaning empty offices early in the morning, and restocking shelves at a local warehouse. I was utterly exhausted, surviving on 4 hours of sleep and cheap instant coffee, all because the bills didn't pay themselves. And every month, my parents would only ask 2 questions. When are the payments due? And did you remember to transfer the tuition money for Ashley? They never once asked how I managed it all, how I found the strength, or if I needed help. Their calculated distance wasn't just indifference, it was transactional. They saw me as a reliable, perpetual source of income, a structural pillar of their comfort, but never as a daughter. I learned to survive inside this emotional and financial vacuum, imagining what it would feel like to be seen, not celebrated, not even loved, just simply acknowledged as a human being worthy of their gaze. The crushing weight of their expectations and the complete lack of reciprocal support built a silent, unforgiving wall between us. I realized I wasn't a member of the family. I was its involuntary financier, a fact that only deepened the toxic conviction that nothing I did could ever meet their impossible standards of real impact. The entire structure of my life was dedicated to preventing the very people who claimed to love me from having to face any form of discomfort or financial reality, a fact that made my mother's eventual words at the dinner all the more devastating and unforgivable. The financial obligation I carried was a physical weight, a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety that never truly dissipated. I was simultaneously the breadwinner and the invisible daughter. Every month, without fail, 3 automatic transfers were queued up in my banking app. The first was for the utility payments for the big Rochester house, ensuring the heat stayed on and the lights never went out in the home where I was barely tolerated. The second was a substantial installment toward the lingering portion of the family mortgage, a debt I took on to reduce their monthly burden. And the third, the heaviest, was the full balance for Ashley's tuition, keeping her securely enrolled in medical school, furthering her journey toward what my mother proudly called meaningful work. My own consulting firm salary, the result of years of grinding sacrifice, was immediately partitioned and siphoned off to support a family that actively diminished me. I lived frugally, constantly calculating every purchase, yet I ensured their lifestyle remained untouched, a silent testament to my profound, misdirected loyalty. This transactional relationship was not only financial but also profoundly emotional, extending even to the dinner I hosted. After graduating from Stanford with my MBA, I decided to move to Seattle. The city, with its rain-soaked determination and glass towers, felt like a clean start, a place built on meritocracy where my achievements might finally stand on their own. The graduation dinner at Delmonico's was meant to be a bridge, a final, expensive effort to make them meet me halfway. I booked the private room, negotiated the menu, paid the substantial deposit, and ordered the finest wine. It wasn't extravagance. It was me desperately trying to architect a moment of forced, public pride. I wanted them to hear the respect in my colleagues' voices, to witness the tangible evidence of my success. I believed, foolishly, that a Stanford degree and a corporate leadership role were undeniable proofs of value, enough to finally tilt the scales. My parents arrived empty-handed, without even a simple card or a congratulations, yet I greeted them with the practiced, controlled smile I had perfected over a lifetime of suppressing my true feelings. I introduced them to Michael, my kind manager, and Professor Klein, who had mentored me through my thesis. The compliments from my colleagues were warm and genuine, a chorus of praise for my capabilities. But my parents' reactions were a masterclass in subtle sabotage. When Professor Klein remarked on the rarity of a Stanford MBA, my mother's smile thinned, and she casually interjected, "We're proud of both our daughters, but Ashley, she's saving lives in the ER. That's real impact." The conversation was immediately redirected. The spotlight effortlessly yanked away from me and swung back to the perpetually golden sister who wasn't even present. Every effort I made to be seen was met with this polished, calculated indifference, confirming that my role was permanent, the support structure, never the centerpiece. The immense cost and effort of the evening were utterly meaningless to them. It was just another stage for them to perform their favoritism, and it was at that very moment, after my father's cruel comparison, that my mother felt comfortable enough to deliver the final, crushing sentence that exposed their true, unwavering contempt for my existence. The moment my mother delivered the sentence, "I wish you were never born," the reality of our relationship, a lifetime of transactional abuse and emotional erasure, crystallized into a truth so sharp it felt like physical pain. It wasn't just a fleeting insult. It was a concise summary of their 25 years of subtle cruelty. It was the confirmation that I had spent my entire adult life trying to pay off a debt for an existence they resented. For a heartbeat, the room was too bright, the silence too loud. I felt the heat rise in my throat, not from anger, but from the sudden, profound understanding of my freedom. There was nothing left to lose, no apology left to crave, and no validation left to earn. The contract was broken. I pushed my chair back, the sound of the scraping would an act of rebellion, and simply said, "Excuse me." I walked out, not crying, not shaking, but with a strange, numb composure, leaving the glittering remnants of the ill-fated celebration behind me. Stepping onto the Seattle sidewalk, the cool night air and the light drizzle wrapped around me like a curtain. The city lights blurred into streaks of gold and blue, mirroring the disorientation in my mind. I walked without a destination, my heels clicking on the hardwood, the rhythm of my departure a silent march of independence. I walked for miles, until the initial shock wore off, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that had been building for decades. Every memory of my childhood flashed past, the forgotten birthdays, the dismissed achievements, the financial burdens I carried without question. Suddenly, all of it felt unbearably heavy. It wasn't just the pain of the words. It was the pain of realizing how long I had allowed myself to be held hostage by the desperate hope that they would one day change. By the time I reached my quiet apartment in Bellevue, my blazer was damp, and my hands were shaking faintly. I kicked off my painful heels and sank onto the floor in the dark, staring at the blinking router light as if it held the key to my next. The silence of the apartment was no longer empty. It was a protective sanctuary. My phone, which I had silenced during the long walk, buzzed insistently on the coffee table. I picked it up. There were 11 missed calls, a frantic mix from my mother and father. I scrolled down to the text message, a final, petty, and utterly predictable attempt at control. The screen glowed with 2 cutting sentences. "You embarrassed us. I hope you're proud of yourself." The word proud twisted in my chest, a bitter, ironic laugh. Proud was something they never felt for me, but something they always demanded I feel for them, a constant, one-way transaction of emotional labor. That text message was the final fracture, the moment something inside me gave way, not with an explosive snap, but with a quiet, steady, internal shift. I felt utterly drained, yet strangely calm. I realized I was not embarrassed by my exit. I was only embarrassed for them. They had created the scene, and I had simply walked out of their toxic stage. I stared at the phone, and the only logical conclusion became crystal clear. If I was never meant to exist, then I should stop existing for them. I opened my banking app, the familiar interface a gateway to my continued servitude. 3 automatic transfers waited in the queue, the family utility payment, the mortgage installment, and, most crucially, Ashley's tuition balance. For a single, agonizing second, my finger hovered over the cancel button. The old version of me, the one who lived and breathed on obligation and the desperate need to keep the peace, fought for breath, whispering about guilt and the possibility of a mistake. But the new self, the one born from the ashes of my mother's cruelty, was stronger, quieter, and steady. With a resolve I hadn't known I possessed, I hit cancel. 1, 2, 3. Each confirmation click resonated in the quiet apartment like a lock turning, severing an invisible chain. The immediate silence that followed was profound. It wasn't empty anymore. It was peaceful, clean, and entirely mine, a space free from the constant, siphoning expectation. The unexpected action was not walking out of the restaurant. It was canceling their financial lifeline, a decision that finally made their stated wish a living reality for them. The silence that followed was 3 weeks long, profound and absolute, stretching between us like an uncrossable chasm. Not a single call came, not a single text, and certainly not an apology or an explanation for the cruelty they had inflicted. This was the same kind of silence they had always demanded from me, unquestioning, subservient, and without resistance, except now, it was pointed back at them, sharp enough to cut. I didn't miss them, not in the way a daughter is supposed to miss her parents. I missed the idea of them, the cherished, invented version I had sustained in my head for years, the hope that one day they would wake up and see me. Letting go of that illusion was painful, a slow, clean extraction of a toxic root, but it was necessary. I began to pour myself entirely into my work, the restructuring project I'd been assigned swallowing entire days whole. For the first time in my professional life, I wasn't just performing, I was seen performing. The professional environment became my true refuge, a place where merit was the only currency. People listened when I spoke. Clients deferred to my judgment because my logic was sound and my data was irrefutable. My manager, Michael, didn't just give me responsibility, he handed it over with the full trust that I would carry it successfully. I wasn't constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for a hidden catch or a comparison to Ashley. I was simply thriving on my own terms. Then, a local business magazine, which had been following our project's incredible turnaround, asked to feature me. The journalist said she wanted to highlight resilience, the story of how a young consultant could thrive when the metaphorical ground underneath her keeps shifting. I didn't mention my family in the interview. I didn't have to. My success was the story. When the article went live, my inbox was flooded, not just with congratulations, but with messages from strangers, people who had endured their own families, who had been made to feel invisible or small, and who whispered, "Thank you," for saying the words they couldn't. Reading their stories felt like standing in a room lit by 100 faces I'd never met, but somehow understood completely. The silence from my own family had been broken by 1,000 voices of solidarity. I was building a new ground underneath myself, one based not on obligation, but on earned respect and self-worth. But quiet is never permanent in families built on entitlement, and the professional acknowledgement of my success was the signal for their inevitable return. On a random Tuesday afternoon, after a grueling 12-hour day, I came home, exhausted and still in my power heels, and found two familiar silhouettes through the frosted glass of my apartment door. I heard my mother's voice, sharp and demanding. "Claire, open the door. We know you're there." My stomach clenched, but I didn't move. I no longer owed them urgency, or even compliance. When I finally opened the door, they swept inside without an invitation, my father taking the couch, my mother pacing, her brittle anger immediately apparent. "We need to talk," she announced, her voice tight. I knew the drill instantly. "About Ashley?" I asked, the question rhetorical, laced with years of bitter resignation. My father folded his hands stiffly, confirming my suspicion. Her internship ended unexpectedly. There were cuts. Her tuition balance is overdue, and if it isn't taken care of immediately, she will be asked to take a leave from the program. He laid out the problem, expecting the automatic solution, the check written without question. I remained standing, refusing to blink, refusing to accept the role of the fixer. My mother snapped, her voice rising in impatience. "We need your help, Claire." The sheer audacity of their request landed like a physical slap, an utter denial of the events of the last month. They hadn't shown up to apologize for the cruelty at the restaurant, to ask how I was, or to acknowledge the fracture they had created. They came solely because their preferred daughter was experiencing a consequence they didn't want to manage. I laughed, a short, bitter sound that held no amusement. "I paid her tuition for years. I covered your bills, the mortgage. I worked myself raw so this family didn't fall apart, and you stood in that restaurant and told me you wished I'd never been born." My father straightened, attempting to reclaim control with a dismissive wave. "We were angry. You made a scene." I stepped closer, closing the distance between us, letting them feel the cold steel of my resolve. "No," I stated clearly, my voice calm but unyielding. "You made the scene. I just walked out of it." The air thinned between us, the silence pregnant with the truth. My mother tried one final, desperate play for control. "You're our daughter," she insisted, her voice rising in a plea for the old terms of engagement. "Family is family." I exhaled a long, steady breath, the old chains finally breaking. "You don't get to play that card now. Not after what you said." The confrontation intensified, a final, necessary battle for my autonomy. My mother's eyes flashed with frustrated indignation. "Claire, you're being unreasonable. You owe us." I cut her off instantly, a lifetime of suppressed arguments finding one clear voice. "I owe you nothing." My father's face contorted in disbelief, leaning on the only claim they had left. We raised you. I shook my head, the motion firm and definitive. You didn't raise me. You drained me. The words hit them harder than any angry outburst. They froze, realizing the power of the truth I had finally spoken. For the first time, they looked small, like two people standing on the wrong side of an irreversible change. I walked toward the door, not to leave, but to open it, holding it wide so the hallway light spilled into the room. If you came here to apologize, I said quietly, offering a small, final courtesy, I would listen. They said nothing, their pride too thick, their entitlement too deeply ingrained. But if you came here to ask for more, I continued, looking each of them directly in the eye, my gaze steady and unshaken, that conversation ended the night you disowned me. My mother scoffed, her arms crossing in a final, petulant gesture of defiance. You're making a mistake. You'll regret this someday. You'll realize you need your family. And that was the final shift, the moment everything inside me aligned into a clarity so sharp it felt like a pure breath of air. The fear, the guilt, the old obligation, it all vanished. I stood tall, taller than I had ever felt in my life, and said the words I never imagined I'd have the strength to speak, the unexpected action that truly fulfilled their wish. Consider me as if I never existed. Live your lives as though there was never a daughter named Claire. They went completely still. My father's lips parted, unable to form a word. My mother's face blanched, the color draining away as the full weight of my statement hit her. They went silent, and for the first time, I wasn't the one shrinking inside that silence. I was the one filling it, owning it. I nodded toward the doorway, the gesture an end to a 25-year burden. It's time for you to leave. My mother hesitated, searching for some final angle, some leverage she no longer possessed, but there was nothing left to take, nothing left to control. She turned sharply, defeated and angry. My father followed, moving slower, like a man walking away from a wreckage he never expected to create. When the door finally clicked shut behind them, the quiet that filled my apartment was not empty or lonely. It was entirely, absolutely mine. In the days that followed, I waited for the familiar ache to return, the crippling guilt, the instinct to fix what was broken. But it never came. Instead, there was a strange stillness inside me, a quiet I had spent my entire life chasing without knowing it. Work surged forward. Our major project closed with results far beyond forecast, and when the client renewed the contract, my manager, Michael, pulled me aside. He handed me the leadership contract I had secretly fought for, saying, "You're ready." This time, I didn't question whether I deserved it. The viral article continued to draw messages from strangers, people who understood what it meant to grow up invisible. Their words felt like a shared understanding, a community I had earned through self-liberation. One night, I stepped onto my balcony, the Seattle skyline pulsing softly beneath a layer of mist, and I thought of the girl who spent years trying to earn love from people who refused to offer it freely. She was gone now. In her place stood someone steadier, quieter, but undeniably whole. On my last night of that long, unraveling season, I stood there with a glass of water, letting the cool air settle against my skin. The city glimmered below, a scatter of lights reflecting off the bay like the world was quietly resetting itself. For the first time, I wasn't wishing for my parents to call or hoping for an apology that would never come. I wasn't rehearsing what I'd say if they did. I was simply breathing, steady, unhurried, finally free. Maybe I was never the daughter they wanted me to be, but in that final, unexpected act of self-preservation, I had become the woman I needed.